Okay, everyone, here we go. We are getting close to the end of this section. We are going to be reading in chapter 19. So we read yesterday that Ivy's dad agreed to let Mr. Ward come and inspect the house. And then she snuck to the house and did find something, but we don't know what it is that she found. Mr. Ward stood on the front porch of the Yamamoto house Friday afternoon, looking as though he were ready for battle. He stood tall, arms crossed, and held a large flashlight in one hand. His lawyer stood at his side holding a briefcase. As Mama, Papa, and Ivy walked up the steps, Mr. Ward strode toward them and held out his free hand. "Mr. Lopez, this is my lawyer, Mr. Pauling." Papa shook hands with both men. "This is my wife, Luz, and my daughter, Ivy." Mr. Pauling nodded. "We appreciate your cooperation, Mr. Lopez. I want to point out that you do not have to allow us inside legally, since you are not the owner of the property, and to confirm that as the caretaker, you are doing this as a favor to Mr. Ward. Is that correct?" "Yes," said Papa, sweeping a hand toward the boarded-up front door. "We must enter from the back of the house." Mr. Ward gave Papa a curt nod. "I'll follow you." Within a few minutes, they all stood in the Yamamoto kitchen. Mama walked ahead of them and clipped up the curtains. Mr. Ward studied the kitchen like a prospective buyer, opening drawers, shining the flashlight into cupboards and under the sink, knocking on walls. Mr. Pauling shadowed him. "As you can see," said Papa, "everything is in good condition." Mr. Ward said nothing and headed into the living room. He lifted the sheets and squinted at the furniture. He picked up a broom that had been left in a corner and tapped on the ceiling. He stomped on the wood floor. When he moved into the first bedroom, he opened the closet. "Have you searched these things?" "We did not check inside the boxes. Ivy and I checked only for rodents and water damage," said Mama, "and to be sure the windows were closed tight." "I have to ask you, Mrs. Lopez," said Mr. Pauling, "just as a matter of record, did you remove anything from the house?" Mama shook her head. "I would never do such a thing." Mr. Pauling looked at Ivy. "No, sir, I haven't taken anything from the house." "But you've spent quite some time here working in the yard," said Mr. Ward. Ivy nodded. "Yes, to make it nice for Kenny Yamamoto when he comes to visit on Sunday." Mr. Ward knelt in front of Ivy. "Now, young lady, do you know that our country is at war with Japan and the Japanese?" "Everybody knows," said Ivy, "since Pearl Harbor." Papa bristled. "Of course she knows. Our son, her brother, is fighting in the United States Army." Mr. Ward stood up. "Mr. Lopez, do you understand that the Japanese who lived here are confined because of their threat to our security?" "Threat?" asked Papa. "When the Yamamotos lived here, there were always people coming and going from this house," said Mr. Ward, "especially after the bombing at Pearl Harbor. And not just other Japanese farmers, Japanese carrying briefcases. And sometimes the lights were on very late at night. There were trucks arriving at all hours." "But that does not mean," said Papa. "How do we know it wasn't ammunition? In times of war, we can't be too careful," said Mr. Ward. "There are Japanese sympathizers who watched our skies before Pearl Harbor. They wrote down descriptions of our planes that flew overhead and reported back to the Japanese government." Papa shook his head. "I do not think the Yamamotos." Mr. Ward's face turned red. "I was trained in this type of work. If you do not allow me to inspect further, I will report my concerns to the police. Is that what you prefer?" All the raised voices made Ivy anxious. She leaned against Mama. Mr. Pauling put a hand on Mr. Ward's arm. "Let's calm down. You must have evidence before you go to the police." Papa stared at Mr. Ward and Mr. Pauling. "I do not understand. I thought you were inspecting the house because you are interested in purchasing it." Mr. Ward sniffed. "I have two concerns: reporting threats to our safety and purchasing the house so the threats never return." "Mr. Lopez, if you'll indulge him, we can get this over with," said Mr. Pauling. Papa pointed to the closet. Mr. Ward dragged box after box into the middle of the room, opening and inspecting each one. He muttered, "Nothing but dishes and bed linens and tea towels." Mr. Ward sniffed again, walked into the second bedroom, and repeated the same inspection. When he found only boxes of children's clothes, he knelt down in front of Ivy. Now, Ivy, when you and your mother came into the house, did you see anything that seemed out of order? Have you seen anything in the shed or the garage or the house that didn't seem usual? She looked from Mr. Ward to Mr. Pauling to Mama and Papa. Her heart exploded with anticipation. She took a deep breath and tried to appear calm. Ivy, answer Mr. Ward, please, said Papa. Do you mean like a secret door? I knew it, said Mr. Ward. Papa stepped forward. Ivy, what are you talking about? This is not a time for pretending. Ivy shook her head. I'm not, Papa. When we checked the house, a box of photographs spilled in the other bedroom. Remember, Mama? You left me to clean them up, and when I put the box on top of the others, I saw a door in the back of the closet with locks on it. I can show you. Mama's face went pale. Why did you not tell me? I'm sorry, Mama. I thought it was just another closet to store things. She hated deceiving Mama even for a few minutes, but it would soon be over. We should call the police, said Mr. Ward. Mr. Pauling held up a hand. Let's make sure it's not just another closet first, shall we? Ivy, show us, said Papa, holding out his hand. She led him to the third bedroom. Mama closed-pinned the curtains to let in the light. Ivy opened the closet door, pushed aside the clothing, and pointed to the hidden door. She watched as Mr. Ward and Mr. Pauling pulled the boxes to the center of the room and moved the hanging clothes. When the closet was clear, Papa tried different keys until both padlocks clicked. He opened the door. Mr. Ward and Mr. Pauling followed the flashlight beam into the room, with Ivy, Mama, and Papa close behind. The light illuminated the room and its contents. Every figure glowed. Oh, Mama gasped. How? Asked Papa. Ivy watched with satisfaction as Mr. Pauling stifled a smile and Mr. Ward's eyes darted from corner to corner. Ivy walked around the room, unlatching and opening the cases. Inside a space the size of a bedroom was not one, but 3 pianos, one of them a grand. Assorted musical instruments lay about, 4 cellos, several basses, flutes, clarinets. Ivy opened at least a dozen violin cases, the instruments and bows resting in their velvet-lined beds. Papa walked along the perimeter of the room. It didn't take him long to look behind the painted screen and see the doors, as Ivy had done yesterday. Double doors. Outside they are covered now with vines and cannot be seen. It makes sense now, yes, said Papa. They could take so little with them to the camps, and Mr. Yamamoto was one of the few in the area who was able to keep his property. He is storing and protecting his friends' most prized possessions. The men you saw going and coming from the house with the briefcases, Papa shrugged. They were carrying instruments. They were musicians. He looked at Ivy and smiled, like my daughter. I think we've seen enough, said Mr. Pauling, turning to leave. No, wait, said Mr. Ward. Confused, he put his hands on his hips. What about inside the piano benches? What about in the stacks of sheet music? There could be secret codes. Mr. Pauling raised his eyebrows and shook his head. Papa lifted the lid of each piano bench and stood by while Mr. Ward rummaged through the Chopin and Beethoven and Brahms. From the third piano bench, Papa took out the only thing inside, a flat box with an intricate pattern of inlaid woods, shiny and with lacquer. He set it on the table with lacquer. That's what kind of makes wood shine. He set it on the table. Mr. Ward stepped forward. Papa lifted the lid. A letter lay on top of the contents. Papa unfolded it. What is it, Papa? Asked Ivy. Papa turned and held out the paper, pointing to the letterhead. This is the official seal of the President of the United States. The letter is a commendation for bravery. He pointed into the box. And these are Mr. Yamamoto's medals for his service to the United States of America during World War I. Mr. Pauling cleared his throat and turned to Mr. Ward. I don't see any government documents or diagrams of the California coastline or pictures of airplanes and ships. Are you satisfied? Mr. Ward seemed puzzled as his eyes drifted around the room. He took a deep breath and stood straighter. It is always better to be safe than sorry. Every man, woman, and child must be diligent. His voice cracked and his eyes filled. So many of our boys have died. So many of our boys. My boy. Grief overtook him and his body shook. Ivy walked to his side. He didn't seem unfriendly any longer. He looked like a father who had lost his son to war. She looked up at him and took his hand. Mama's eyes filled with tears as she appeared on his other side and gently held his arm, and together they led him from the house. Okay, so you can see that Mr. Ward in some ways is trying to find something wrong with the Yamamotos. And because when someone loses someone, they want someone to blame. And to have someone to focus your anger on helps. And so he was wanting to blame them for the death of his son. And he was taking his emotions, which he had turned to rage, out on them. But then saw that there was nothing there. So it says in your next question, what was Mr. Yamamoto hiding? And was it what Mr. Ward was expecting? So absolutely not. Mr. Ward was expecting something because he did see all the people coming and going. But he thought that they were possibly spies. And then the next one, what caused Mr. Ward to go to great lengths to find evidence against the Yamamotos? And I told you this just a minute ago. He is trying to find someone to blame, isn't he? He's wanting to take it out on someone to have proof. Because he's hurt. He's grieving. And this has destroyed him. And in some ways, when we are destroyed, lots of times our reaction is to want someone else to hurt too. Have you ever heard the phrase, misery loves company? Well, that's part of it. Okay. Now, they talk about how they couldn't take their instruments and that they were trying to have someplace safe to put them. I want you to think of something else that if you, and this can be personal to you, if you had to leave instantly and you were taken somewhere where you couldn't take anything of value, you could only take really what you could carry. Maybe you were allowed a suitcase, but you were only allowed what was absolutely necessary for you to take: clothing, maybe a toothbrush, something like that. What is something that you would want to store safely until you could get back to it? So what is something that you would like to store so that you could make sure that you wouldn't lose it? And if you don't have anything personal, put something down that you think someone else would. If the Japanese were wanting to save their instruments, what might be something else that they would want to put away so that they wouldn't have to lose in the time that they were gone? Okay? All right. We'll finish up her part of this story on Monday.